It happened so suddenly that I still hear the sound of that envelope sliding under my door. I thought it was just the wind, but when I looked down, I saw a folded piece of paper with my name written in shaky letters. I picked it up, and my heart sank the moment I read the words, "Leave your house in 10 minutes. Act normal. Trust me." I froze. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake or some cruel prank. But something in the handwriting, something desperate, made me listen. I glanced around my quiet little home, the one I'd lived in for over 3 decades, and suddenly the air felt heavy. Every sound, every tick of the clock felt louder than it should. I peeked out the window and saw my neighbor Harold, pacing at the edge of his driveway like a man being chased by his own thoughts. He looked up, saw me, and shook his head fast, mouthing the words, "Now, go." That was when the fear truly hit. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing. I had 10 minutes to decide whether to trust him or not. Thank you so much for watching and for being here with me tonight. It means more than you know. Before I begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing how far my stories travel and whose heart they find. My name is Mary. I live in a small town in northern Mexico, a quiet place where the nights are soft and the neighbors still wave from across the street. I've spent most of my life here, in this house that smelled of coffee in the mornings and fresh laundry in the evenings. A house built by my husband's hands long before he passed. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was mine, and every corner held a memory that still whispered his name. That evening had started like any other, with me folding the last of the laundry while my old jazz record played low in the background, the one he used to hum along to when he fixed the sink or trimmed the roses. The rhythm of the music kept me company, the way memories often do when you live alone. I remember looking at the clock after I read that note, feeling my pulse tick in time with every second that passed. 10 minutes. That's all I had. I didn't even know what I was preparing for, but something deep inside me told me this wasn't a joke. I looked around the room and suddenly everything looked fragile, my world hanging by a thread I couldn't see. I wanted to stay, to believe this was some misunderstanding, but when I glanced out again and saw Harold's face, pale and tense, I knew something was terribly wrong. I grabbed my keys, my purse, and my husband's ring that I kept on the counter. My hands were trembling so badly that I dropped the ring twice before I managed to close it in my fist. I remember whispering to myself, "Trust him, Mary. Just trust him." Those words felt strange coming out of my mouth because trust was not something I gave easily anymore. But there was something about the way Harold stood there, glancing at my house like it might crumble any second, that made me move. I opened the door quietly, locking it behind me out of habit, and stepped out into the cool night. He didn't say a word, just nodded once and reached for my arm, his grip firm but gentle, and together we started walking down the street, away from the home that had carried my whole life inside it. Each step felt heavier than the last, and though I didn't understand what I was leaving behind, I could feel in my bones that whatever was coming, it wasn't just another quiet evening. As we walked, I kept glancing at Harold, trying to read his face, but his eyes stayed fixed ahead, and the tension in his jaw told me not to ask questions yet. The night air felt strange, too still, like the world itself was holding its breath. The only sounds were the rhythm of our footsteps and the faint hum of crickets hiding in the grass. I wanted to speak, to ask what was going on, but my throat felt dry, as if the words were too heavy to push out. Every few steps he would squeeze my arm a little tighter, not to scare me, but to keep me moving. We passed the bakery, the one that always smelled of sweet bread even after closing, and then the park where I used to sit with my husband on Sunday afternoons. I looked at the swings, swaying gently in the breeze, and a tear slipped down before I even realized I was crying. I thought of everything inside my home. My photo albums, my wedding china, my letters from him, the little things you don't think about until you have to walk away. I turned slightly, just enough to see the faint glow of my house at the end of the street, and that's when Harold said quietly, "Don't look back, Mary." Not yet. There was something in his tone that stopped me cold, a mix of urgency and fear, and I obeyed. We crossed another block, and I began to hear a sound I couldn't quite place, low at first, then sharper, a siren cutting through the silence. My stomach tightened. Another followed, and another. And suddenly, the night that had been so calm moments ago turned restless. People started stepping out of their houses, confused, whispering to each other. Harold didn't stop. He pulled me toward the corner of Elm Street where the lights from the highway flickered faintly, and only then did he slow down enough to breathe. I looked at him, waiting, but he still wouldn't meet my eyes. His hand was shaking, and I could see a bead of sweat sliding down his temple despite the cool air. Finally, I found my voice. I asked him what was happening, what this was all about. He looked at me then, his face pale under the streetlight, and said softly, "You're safe now, Mary. That's all that matters. Just stay with me." The way he said it made my heart pound even harder because it wasn't a comfort, it was a warning dressed as one. My body felt heavy, but my mind was racing, trying to piece together reasons that made sense. Maybe there was a gas leak, maybe some electrical fault, maybe. My thoughts stopped the moment I heard a deep rumble echo through the ground beneath our feet. I didn't understand at first, but Harold did. His eyes widened, and before I could turn around, the sound grew into something fierce, something final. The sirens were closer now, and the flashing lights bounced off the nearby windows, painting everything red and blue. Then, I smelled it, smoke. Thick, acrid, unmistakable smoke that curled its way through the night air. My heart cracked in two as I realized where it was coming from. I wanted to run back, but Harold caught my arm again, shaking his head with tears in his eyes. "Don't, Mary. Please don't look back." But I did. Just once. Just long enough to see the orange glow rising from where my little yellow house once stood, the one that had kept my memories safe all these years. And in that instant, everything I thought was solid about my life began to fall apart. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I just stood there frozen, watching the smoke twist into the night sky like something alive, dark and cruel, stealing the air around us. My house, my safe place, the one I'd built with love and patience, was burning before my eyes. The flames climbed so fast it didn't feel real, like a terrible dream I couldn't wake from. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. All I could do was whisper my husband's name, hoping somehow he could hear me, wherever he was. Harold's hand was still gripping my arm, firm but shaking, and when I turned to him, I saw fear mixed with guilt in his eyes. He said softly, "Mary, we have to keep walking." I didn't understand why, but I let him lead me further away, the sound of sirens growing louder behind us, echoing off the walls of the houses that still stood untouched. Every step felt heavier than the last, like my heart was tied to the flames that were eating my home. We stopped 3 blocks away, near an old bench under the streetlight, and I finally looked at him and asked what was happening. His face was pale, and his voice cracked when he said, "I couldn't let you die in there." I stared at him, my mind spinning, not knowing whether to believe what I was hearing. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, burned-looking piece of metal wrapped in tape. "They planted this under your car, Mary," he said. "And when that didn't work, they found another way." My legs gave out beneath me. I sat on the cold ground, shaking, staring at the little device like it could still hurt me. "Who would do something like that?" I asked, but part of me was already afraid of the answer. Harold hesitated, his eyes darting toward the fire in the distance, then back to me. "I overheard them at the hardware store yesterday," he said quietly. "2 young men talking about finishing a job tonight. They mentioned your address, your name, everything. I didn't think it was real at first, but when I saw them near your house this evening, I knew." I tried to process his words, but they didn't fit together in my mind. None of it made sense. I kept shaking my head, saying no over and over, like if I said it enough, the truth would change. But it didn't. The more he spoke, the more the pieces began to connect. The strange phone calls, the unfamiliar car parked near my driveway last week, the contractor who'd shown up to inspect the gas line, even though I hadn't requested one. And then Harold said something that stopped my breath entirely. "Mary, they weren't strangers. Someone close to you hired them." I felt the world tilt under my feet. I wanted to believe he was wrong, that he'd misunderstood, but deep inside, a quiet part of me knew who it might be. The thought burned hotter than the fire behind us. I closed my eyes and whispered, "No, not him. He wouldn't." But the way Harold looked at me told me he already knew the truth I didn't want to face. That night, standing in the glow of everything I had lost, I realized that the fire had only destroyed wood and walls. The real damage had already been done, by someone whose betrayal would scar deeper than any flame ever could. I sat there on that cold pavement, my eyes fixed on the smoke rising higher, my mind trying to hold on to reason while my heart began to break in slow motion. Harold kept his voice low, gentle, careful, as if any loud word might shatter me completely. He told me that the men he overheard were hired under false contracts, paid in cash, told to make it look like an accident, a gas leak or an electrical fault. I listened, numb, staring at my trembling hands. Every word felt like another crack in the life I thought I understood. I asked him again, who could have done this, and he hesitated before answering. I think it's someone who knows you very well, Mary. Someone who had access to your home, to your information. My heart skipped. There was only one person who fit that description. My son, Daniel. I whispered his name so softly it barely reached my own ears. Harold didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. The thought hit me like a wave, leaving me breathless. I couldn't imagine it, couldn't accept that the same boy I'd raised with my own hands could be capable of something so cruel. I thought of the nights I stayed awake waiting for him to come home safe when he was younger. The sacrifices I made so he could go to college. The way I prayed for his happiness every single day. And now, all those prayers seemed to echo back empty. I remembered how distant he had become lately, how his tone had shifted whenever money came up, how he insisted I sign new insurance papers last month, telling me it was just routine. I hadn't trusted it then, and thank God I didn't, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was already done. Harold said he'd already called the police, that they were looking into it, that I needed to stay somewhere safe. But all I could think about was my son's face the last time I saw him, smiling as he promised to visit soon. That memory twisted my chest in ways I can't explain. I turned to Harold, my voice trembling. Why would he do this? What could make a child turn on his own mother like that? He didn't answer right away. He just sighed and said, "Money changes people, Mary. It makes good men forget who they are." I looked up at the sky, the stars faint behind the haze of smoke, and I thought of my husband, how proud he had been of our little family, how much he had trusted that Daniel would take care of me when he was gone. I felt like I had failed him, failed us all. The sound of sirens faded into the distance, replaced by the crackle of what was left of my home burning away. I wanted to go back, to see it one last time, but Harold said the area was sealed. So I sat there shaking, until exhaustion pulled me into silence. I had nothing left but the truth, and even that felt like a burden too heavy to carry. But as the night grew darker, one thought began to form, steady and clear. If my son had turned against me for money, then he wasn't the person I had raised, and I wasn't going to let his greed destroy what was left of my spirit. Something inside me hardened then, quietly but completely. I would find out exactly what he had done, and I would make sure that this story didn't end with me as the victim. It would end with me standing. When the sun began to rise, I was still sitting on that same sidewalk, my clothes smelling of smoke, my thoughts circling like restless birds that refused to land. The world felt different somehow, colder, emptier, yet painfully clear. Harold brought me a cup of coffee from the corner cafe, and though my hands could barely hold it steady, the warmth reminded me that I was still alive, still here, and that meant something. He sat beside me in silence for a long time, and I could feel he wanted to say more, but didn't know where to begin. Finally, he told me the police had confirmed what he suspected. The men who set the fire were already in custody, and one of them had started talking. He said there were messages, phone calls, instructions that came from someone with my last name. My heart clenched so tight it hurt. Harold handed me his phone, showing me a photo the officers had shared with him. A screenshot of one of the text messages. It was short, casual, almost careless. It said, "Make sure it looks natural. She'll be out by then." The name attached to it was Daniel. My Daniel. My only child. I couldn't look away from the screen. It felt like my body went numb, like all the years I had loved him, all the prayers I had whispered had been erased in one instant. The betrayal was a quiet kind of pain, the The kind that doesn't scream or break things, it just sits deep inside your chest and takes your breath away. Harold reached over and said softly, "Mary, he doesn't know you're alive. They thought you'd still be inside." The words cut deeper than any wound could. I tried to understand what could drive him to such a thing. Maybe he was desperate. Maybe someone convinced him it was just business. But no reason could ever make it right. Harold told me the police wanted to question me later that morning, that I would need to explain everything I knew about the new insurance policies. I nodded, though my thoughts were far away. I kept thinking back to the moment Harold slipped that note under my door. How close I had been to never seeing another sunrise. If he hadn't acted, if he hadn't been brave enough to warn me, I would have been another name in tomorrow's newspaper, gone without knowing the truth. I turned to him and asked, "Why did you do it, Harold? You could have walked away." He smiled a sad kind of smile and said, "Because someone had to care enough to do the right thing." I felt tears fill my eyes again, but this time they weren't only for what I had lost. They were for what I had been given. A second chance to face the truth. I realized then that surviving wasn't just about escaping the fire. It was about walking through the ashes and refusing to let them define me. I promised myself, sitting on that bench, that I would tell the police everything, that I would let the truth come out no matter how painful it was. I wanted justice, not revenge. I wanted peace, not silence. And even though my heart ached with the weight of what Daniel had done, I also knew I couldn't let that darkness swallow me whole. Somewhere inside, a small, steady flame began to flicker again. The kind that no fire could destroy. When the officers came later that morning, I felt like I was walking through a fog. Everything around me looked familiar but distant, as if the world had stepped a few feet away and I was no longer a part of it. They asked gentle questions at first, trying not to overwhelm me. But every word they spoke sounded heavier than it should. I told them everything I remembered. About the note, about Harold, about the contractors who had been around my house recently, and about the insurance papers Daniel had tried to make me sign. One of the detectives, a tall woman with kind eyes, listened closely and said she'd already spoken to the men in custody. They had admitted that Daniel promised them a large payout once the claim went through. Hearing those words made my stomach twist, because now it wasn't just suspicion or whispers, it was truth, sharp and undeniable. After the officers left, Harold offered to drive me to a small hotel on the other side of town, a quiet place where I could rest and gather my thoughts. As we drove, I stared out the window, watching the town I'd lived in for so long pass by, like an old memory I couldn't touch anymore. My house, or what was left of it, was still blocked off with yellow tape, and even from a distance, the sight made me sick with grief. I thought about the flowers in my garden that would never bloom again, the pictures that had hung on the walls, the scent of cinnamon that always lingered in my kitchen after I baked. It was all gone, turned to ash by someone who once called me mother. The ache in my chest was almost unbearable, but beneath that ache was something else growing slowly. Resolve. At the hotel, I sat on the bed and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked older, not just from the smoke or the sleepless night, but from the weight of everything that had happened. I whispered to myself, "You're still here, Mary. You're still breathing." That simple truth gave me strength I didn't know I had left. Harold came by later that afternoon with a notebook and said the police wanted me to write down anything I could remember, no matter how small. I took the pen, and as I began to write, memories started surfacing. Odd phone calls, strange visits, receipts Daniel left lying around when he came by last month. Even the way he had been pushing me to sign over certain documents without explaining them clearly. Each detail painted a clearer picture, one I didn't want to see but had to. When I finished, Harold looked at me and said, "This will help them build the case, Mary. It'll help you too." His words reminded me that surviving wasn't enough. I had to protect myself now, and I had to make sure that no one else would ever get away with something like this again. That evening, as I sat by the window watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I thought about forgiveness and whether it had a place in this kind of pain. I didn't have the answer, not yet, but I knew I wouldn't let hatred take root in me. I had lost too much already. Instead, I told myself that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, quietly but firmly, saying, "Not this time." And for the first time since that night, I believed it. The next day, I woke up to a knock on the door of my hotel room, and for a moment, I thought it was just the cleaning lady. But when I opened it, Harold was standing there, holding a folder and a look that told me something new had come to light. He walked in slowly, sat down, and placed the folder on the table between us without saying a word. I hesitated before opening it, because deep down I already knew whatever was inside would change everything again. Inside were printed copies of text messages, bank transfers, and call logs, all pointing to Daniel. Seeing his name next to words that spoke so casually about ending my life made my stomach turn. There was one message that stood out above all the rest. It said, "Once it's done, file the claim fast. We can split it before the bank freezes her account." I stared at that line for what felt like forever. Those were my son's words, written without hesitation, without care, like my life was a problem to be solved for money. I pressed my fingers against my lips, trying not to cry, but the tears came anyway, hot and relentless. Harold leaned forward and said softly, "They're going to arrest him, Mary. They already have enough." I couldn't speak. I just nodded, even though my whole body felt like it was breaking apart. I didn't know whether to feel relief or devastation. I had wanted the truth, and now that I had it, it felt heavier than I imagined. I sat there in silence, the sound of the air conditioner filling the room, and thought about the day Daniel was born. How small he had been in my arms, how his tiny hand wrapped around my finger. I never thought I'd live long enough to see the day I'd be afraid of my own child. Harold reached out and held my hand, and for a long time neither of us said anything. Then he whispered, "You did nothing wrong, Mary. Don't carry his guilt." I wanted to believe that, but the heart doesn't follow logic. I felt like I'd failed as a mother. Like somewhere along the way, I missed the moment he lost his goodness. The police called that afternoon, asking if I was willing to come in and make an official statement. I agreed, though part of me wanted to hide forever. At the station, the officers were kind, their questions careful, but each answer I gave was like reopening a wound. When they showed me the final piece of evidence, a recorded call between Daniel and one of the hired men, I closed my eyes and listened. I recognized his voice instantly, calm and confident as he planned what he thought would be my final night. When the recording ended, I felt hollow. There are no words to describe hearing the person you love most talk about your death as if it were an inconvenience. The detective asked if I wanted to press full charges, and I said yes. My voice didn't shake when I said it, and that surprised me. I realized I wasn't doing it out of anger. I was doing it because truth deserves to be spoken, no matter how painful it is. When I left the station, the air outside felt sharp and clean, like the world was starting over without asking me first. Harold drove me back to the hotel, and I sat quietly the whole way, watching the city blur past the window. I thought about how quickly life can change, how one decision, one note, one moment of courage from a neighbor can mean the difference between life and death. I turned to Harold and said, "You saved me." He shook his head gently and replied, "No, Mary, you saved yourself when you decided to trust." His words settled deep inside me, and for the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness, not yet, but peace. The kind that comes when the truth finally stops running. The days that followed felt like walking through the echoes of my own life. Everything looked the same from a distance, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The police handled the rest, and I was told Daniel had been arrested quietly. No struggle, no words, just silence as they took him away. When I heard that, I didn't cry right away. I just sat there still, staring at the cup of tea in my hands until it went cold. It's strange how grief can sneak up on you even when the person you grieve is still alive. I thought about visiting him, about looking him in the eyes and asking why, but the truth is, I was afraid of the answer. What could he possibly say that would make sense of it all? Harold came by every morning to check on me, bringing fresh bread or the newspaper, making sure I wasn't alone. One morning he said quietly, "You know, Mary, this could have ended very differently. You should be proud you made it through." I smiled faintly because I knew he meant well, but inside I didn't feel proud. I felt tired, worn down to the bone by a kind of sorrow that words can't carry. Still, I was grateful to be alive, grateful that kindness had found me in time. I started writing again, keeping a small journal by my bedside, where I wrote down not the pain, but the lessons, the pieces of hope I wanted to remember later. I wrote about trust, about how fragile it can be, and about forgiveness, which I wasn't ready for yet but hoped might come someday. The night before the court hearing, I stood by the hotel window, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance, and whispered to myself that life would go on. Not the same life, not the one I had before, but a new one built on truth instead of illusion. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I wouldn't face it broken. I would face it as a woman who had walked through fire and survived. The morning of the hearing came quietly, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest before a storm. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple gray dress that still smelled faintly of smoke, no matter how many times it had been washed. Harold drove me to the courthouse, and the closer we got, the heavier the air seemed to feel. I had imagined that day 100 different ways, but nothing could have prepared me for what it would truly feel like to sit in that room and see my son again. When they brought him in, my breath caught for a moment. He looked smaller somehow, thinner, older, like guilt had carved lines into his face overnight. Our eyes met for just a second, and in that second, everything I wanted to say to him collided in silence. I saw the boy I once carried, the man who had betrayed me, and the stranger he had become, all in the same face. The prosecutor read through the evidence calmly, every word like a cold wind against my heart. Messages, transactions, records, all of it laid out like a map of destruction that led back to me. Daniel never looked up, not even once, and I think that hurt the most. I wanted him to see me, to face what he'd done, but he kept his eyes fixed on the table, as if that could erase the truth. When the judge spoke, her tone was firm but not cruel, and as she read the charges, I realized justice doesn't bring peace right away. It just opens the door for it to come later, slowly, quietly. When it was over, I walked out without looking back because I couldn't bear to see him taken away. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright for such a heavy day. Harold stood waiting near the car, his hands in his pockets, his expression filled with quiet understanding. I told him I didn't feel victory, only a kind of sad relief. Like a wound had finally been cleaned, but still stung from the air touching it. He nodded and said, "Healing always hurts before it helps." Those words stayed with me all the way back to the hotel. That night, I sat alone, the sound of the city soft and distant beyond the window, and thought about everything that had been lost and everything that still remained. I still had breath in my lungs, a neighbor who had risked his safety to save me, and a chance, however fragile, to rebuild something new from the ashes. Life doesn't promise fairness, but it does give us moments of mercy, and I had been given mine. I closed my eyes, whispered a prayer for the son I no longer knew, and another one for the strength to forgive him someday, even if forgiveness had to wait a while. The days after the hearing felt strange, as if time itself had slowed down to let me feel every emotion I had been too numb to face before. I would wake up before dawn, sit by the window with my cup of coffee, and watch the world outside carry on as if nothing had changed, even though everything inside me had. The weight of the past weeks still pressed heavy on my chest, but somewhere under all that pain, there was a quiet strength beginning to grow. Fragile but real. I spent hours thinking about forgiveness, not because I was ready to give it, but because I needed to understand what it truly meant. Could you forgive someone who had tried to end your life? Someone you had given everything to? Could you forgive your own heart for still missing the person it should hate? Those questions circled in my mind until they softened into something else. Not answers exactly, but acceptance that maybe some wounds never fully close, they just stop bleeding. Harold visited often, sometimes just to sit with me in silence, other times to talk about small things like the weather or the new cafe opening down the street. His presence reminded me that kindness can still exist in a world where betrayal once lived. One afternoon as we sat together, he said, "You know, Mary, you can start again. You don't have to go back to what was lost. You can build something new, just for you." His words settled deep in me, and that night, I thought about what starting again might look like. Maybe a little house in another town, maybe a garden where I could plant something that would grow in peace. I realized that surviving wasn't the end of my story, it was just the beginning of a new one. I went to see what was left of my old home a few days later, escorted by the police. The smell of ash still hung in the air, the walls were gone, and the ground was dark with soot. But standing there, I didn't feel despair anymore. I felt gratitude that I had lived to stand on that same soil again. I bent down, picked up a small piece of my kitchen tile, and held it close, not as a reminder of loss, but as proof that I had endured. I whispered a quiet goodbye to the life that had burned away and promised myself that I would fill the next chapter with peace, even if it took time to find it. As I walked back to the car, the breeze carried the faintest scent of jasmine from somewhere nearby, and for the first time in a long while, I smiled. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was hope. And that was enough to keep me moving forward. In the weeks that followed, I began to find a rhythm again, slow and uncertain at first, but steady enough to keep me moving. I rented a small house near the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just a place with a little garden and sunlight that poured through the kitchen window every morning. It felt strange, waking up somewhere new, surrounded by unfamiliar walls, yet there was something comforting about knowing those walls held no secrets, no echoes of lies. Just peace. I spent my mornings tending to the plants Harold helped me buy, herbs and flowers that brought life back into the silence. Each seed I planted felt like a small act of defiance against everything that had tried to destroy me. At night, I would sit by the window and talk to my husband in whispers, telling him about my day, about the stars, about how I was learning to breathe again without the weight of fear pressing on my chest. Harold visited often, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting with me as the sun went down, and though neither of us said it out loud, we both understood that friendship had become our quiet salvation. One evening, as we shared a simple dinner, he said something that stayed with me. "Mary, you've been through fire and came out with grace. That's strength most people never find." I smiled, not because I believed I was strong, but because I knew I was trying to be. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in small pieces, like the first morning you wake up and realize you didn't cry, or the first night you sleep without waking from a dream of smoke. I started writing again too, filling pages with thoughts I'd never spoken aloud. Not about pain, but about courage. About how even when everything is taken from you, you can still choose what kind of heart you'll have when it's over. I realized that surviving wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about remembering without letting it poison you. There were still moments when sadness crept in quietly, when I'd see a mother and son laughing together and feel an ache that words can't soften. But instead of bitterness, I let it remind me that love, no matter how broken, still has value. Forgiveness hadn't come yet. Maybe it never fully would. But peace had begun to take its place. And that was enough. Some nights, when the wind moved through the trees outside my new home, I would close my eyes and think of how close I had come to losing everything. And then I would smile softly to myself. Grateful for the neighbor who cared enough to slip a note under my door. Grateful for the strength I didn't know I had, and grateful for the quiet that finally felt safe again. As time went on, I began to see life in a different light, softer somehow, as if the world had been washed clean by everything I had endured. The pain didn't disappear, it simply learned to rest beside me, and in that quiet space, gratitude began to grow. I often found myself thinking about that night, about the note that saved my life, and how a single act of kindness from a neighbor changed everything. It made me realize how fragile we all are, and how sometimes the smallest gesture, a warning, a word, a bit of courage, can become the line between tragedy and survival. I started visiting the park again, the same one my husband and I used to sit in years ago, and I would watch the sunset melt into the hills, painting the sky in colors I had forgotten existed. There, I would whisper to myself that peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the decision to keep living even when it hurts. I forgave Daniel in my heart, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved to be free from the shadow of his choices. My heart still aches for the boy he once was, but I no longer carry the weight of what he became. Instead, I carry the strength that came from surviving him. Now, when I close my eyes at night, I sleep without fear. And when I wake up, I thank God for one more sunrise, one more chance to choose hope. Thank you, my dear ones, for staying with me till the end of my story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe, share this video, and tell me where you're watching from. Your words, your time, and your presence mean more than you know.